I am so excited. Day 2. I'm caffeinated. I'm rested. I look like a whole new human from yesterday. It's amazing what 8 hours of sleep will do for you.
I know it. I know it.
Once again, nothing but positive feedback from yesterday's event. And I heard we had over 3,000 viewers online. Mm-hmm. Not a small feat.
I know.
That's a
good.
lot of people. That's
good,
a small arena. That's a Norah Jones concert.
It's like a little pond that we're all swimming in.
That is not a small feat. Well, I'm really excited to have you back for day 2. And I've already told Antoinette, what are we doing for next year? So I'm always trying to make sure. I've never had a better experience than I've had with Susan for long arm instruction. This isn't something that everybody always jives well with. And everybody has different opinions and different ideas and the way to do things. And everybody loves the way that you teach. So really happy that you're here again. Yes. And so what do you have in store for us today?
Well, we have 2 sessions again today. So at this first one, adjusting the mic
I'll kick it over to you, and then I'll leave. Do you need me?
Very good.
Okay.
Nope, it's all great. It's all great.
I'll kick it over to you.
Okay. This first session, we're going to be talking about free motion or freehand quilting. Some of you may be so familiar with that already, some of you much less so. So I've got some samples to bring along. I have my quilt that I was working on yesterday, which is totally finished. I mean, not the binding, but finished quilting and all trimmed up, ready to go, so we can look at that, talk it over a little bit, and I'm just going to talk about some of the reasons why I love free motion quilting and see if they appeal to you as well. I don't know that everyone loves it, so it's not for everyone, but everyone that wants to absolutely can. So that's kind of my mission as a quilting teacher, is to make it approachable and doable and show that there's a systematic way to learn it. It's not magical. It's not only special people that can do it. Everybody can that wants to. So that's going to be this morning's session, talking about free motion quilting. And then this afternoon at the 1:30 p.m. Central session, 1:30? 1 o'clock. 1 o'clock. The 1 o'clock Central session, we're going to be delving into a bit of ruler work. So I'll show you some of the equipment that we need for that, some of the things that you can do with it. I brought some samples to show, and then I brought a small, very informal project that we're going to work on. So I'll show some things, and there will be room for our in-house people, if they wish, to quilt on that project as well, to get a little feel for it. So a bit interactive in that way. So that's what we're doing today. Okay, I thought this morning we'd begin with a couple things that highlight how easy a Bernina machine is to care for. This was kind of a news flash to me when I first acquired my Bernina, which is only not quite 2 years ago, actually, that I've been driving a Bernina. And one of the features that so appeals to me is how easy they are to care for. Now, I think we're going to want our close-up camera for this, Mr. Producer, sir. And I should take a sec before I fully get going to give a huge thank you to my husband, Dave, who I always call Mr. Producer. He's in the background running all the cameras and the wires and the cables and holding up notes to me, say this, don't forget that. And it really, really, really helps. And of course, an enormous thank you to Stitch House, who is hosting this event. So we've got a live in-person audience and you all who are watching online. Okay. So at our close-up camera, this is the kind of thing that I do each morning when I'm beginning my quilting, and if I'm putting in a full day, I'll do it a couple of times throughout the day. So, but this first part, this is kind of my, before I get started, I always do this. And number one is I find a paintbrush, hardware store variety paintbrush will absolutely work, and frankly, the scruffier it is, the better, because you're going to use it to pull lint out of your bobbin area, and if it's got rough edges, that's just all the better for picking up that lint, right? So I should have showed this, I just did it quietly while I was talking. The bobbin, the flat plate that I'm sewing on simply pops out, no hardware required. There's a little kind of target printed on it, you just push that and it pops right out, giving you access to the bobbin area. And of course, my bobbin door at the front swings open. Let's do that again. Super simple. On the little target, I just press and it pops open. And if you have a brand new machine, I've heard lots of people say that goes very hard, that pressing, just press harder. It does get easier with use. There's just a spring load in the back. So that gives me access then to all this area. And you see the lint I'm brushing out? That is a good thing. And I turn my hand wheel a little bit so that I can access more areas around the bobbin casing and just brush that all out. Underneath as well, I go ahead and pull my bobbin out and brush inside that bobbin casing and the whole housing. And honestly, today we're not seeing very much lint. This as I go on today, I'll probably talk a little bit more about the thread that I love to use. I know I mentioned it yesterday, Isacord thread, which is a 100% polyester thread. That's my favorite. Now, I'm not necessarily brand loyal. There are other brands of poly thread that work really well. I just happen to collect the Isacord colors, and it's an efficiency really when you're doing a lot of quilting to use the same brand and weight a lot, because you don't have to make adjustments very often then, right? So that happens to be my choice. I have a thread giveaway, but I think I'll save that for just a minute. Anyway, back to the poly thread. The beauty of polyester is that it's very, very, very low lint. So it is a little bit shiny. It has a little bit of gloss to it. It was, Isacord particularly, was originally developed as an embroidery thread. So it is intended for fast, high-speed stitching, for strength, and for that little bit of gloss. So knowing those qualities helps you choose what thread you want to use. There are quilters that prefer the non-gloss, so they end up with threads that have a certain amount of cotton in them, or cottonized is a word that's used. So this is not intended to be a lecture on thread. Just know there are options out there. But the reason I choose the poly is because of the low lint and the strength for high-speed stitching. So that works well for me. If I was using a cotton thread in here, I would have to be cleaning out that lint every single bobbin, and perhaps even in between bobbins. It's 10 or 20 times as much. It's not a little bit more lint, it's a lot more lint. When I use my poly threads, you guys watched me stitching yesterday. I did that whole small quilt, and what you saw me clean today was the result of lint from that. So there's quite a difference there. Okay, that all said, I've got my bobbin casing out, and I'm going to do my oiling. And I've got this handy little oiling pen. There are different tools available at home. I have a kind of squeeze bottle with a screw cap. Any of them will work, but you do want a fairly fine tip that will emit just a drop and not a flood. So I expose. There's a tiny little tongue, which I very much doubt that we'll be able to see on camera, but there's one tiny tongue. Your manual shows you where it is, and you put 1 or 2 drops on that, and that's it. Turn the flywheel a few times, distribute it a little bit, and that's it. That's my maintenance for the morning. Clean the lint out, do the drop of oil. There's a question, yes? I use the 40 weight, which is their their embroidery thread. They do, of course, sell other threads, but if you look for their embroidery thread, it's a 40 weight. And that's fairly common, and other brands do it too. Wonderfil has a 40 weight, Glide has a 40 weight, and a 60 weight, which is very nice. Those are the 2 brands that are coming to mind, and they're great brands. I don't mean to be disparaging about any of the brands. So, okay, we put in our drop of oil, and now the bobbin casing goes back in. And actually, my bobbin is very nearly empty from yesterday's stitching, so I'm going to go ahead and load a fresh bobbin for today. We wound one already yesterday, so it's ready to go. Close up my oil cap. There's a question, yes.
You gave a point yesterday of saying not to embroider all the way full. So
About how full?
about how shy of the outer rim.
Okay, so we were talking about this yesterday, and I can't remember if it was on air or not. I was talking about the level of thread when you load your bobbin. Sometimes your machine or your separate bobbin winder will wind your bobbins full, and the temptation is to wind that bobbin as full as you can so you can wind as few bobbins as possible. Of course, we all want that. But the truth is, if your thread is as full, flush with the outside of your bobbin, you'll end up with a bit of resistance on those early uses of the bobbin, and you'll end up with tension issues. So I have mine literally just, I don't know if you can even see it here in-house. It's just inside the red rim, like just lower than the rim, a thread or 2 width. It's a very small amount, but it does make a difference. So that's my bobbin. In it goes. And by the way, that little snap is kind of an important thing, and a lot of machines will have this, but certainly the Bernina does. When you're hanging onto the lip of it, there's a little post that you rest it on. I just get it on that post, and then I let that hinge close and just push it in with my thumb, and I'll hear a particular snap. And this time I didn't hear it quite right, so I'm going to pull it out again, because that is my first gauge as to whether I've got my bobbin in there correctly. And every time I'm talking on camera, I do it wrong. That's just the way it goes. Snap. And that's a sound that confirms to me it's correct. And I talked about yesterday this idea of getting to know your machine so well. And this is part of it. You know exactly what a bobbin should sound like and feel like when it snaps into place. And if that's not 100% right, do it again. It's faster to do that than to start stitching and get a big gnarl going on. And then I also pull on that thread tail to see if that feels right. And I can tell you right now, mine is feeling too tight today. No point in starting stitching till I address that and figure out why that is. So first off, I'm just going to reseat my bobbin in the casing and see if that feels better. That feels good. I can do my little dangle test. Should pull the bobbin casing upright, but not lift it off my hand. If I had a TOA gauge, I could do that too. All of those work. That still feels very tight, and I'm not sure why. So I'm going to actually get under there and look and see if there's some thread perhaps in there. Do another brush, because something is definitely amiss. I don't see anything visibly. Let's keep persisting. We got to get it right. Yeah, that still is way too tight. And sometimes if this happens repeatedly at home, sometimes I'll just get a fresh bobbin if I can't figure it out. There's no point in getting frustrated with it. Sometimes I'll pull a couple yards off the bobbin. Maybe that'll be my next solution. Oh, there we go though. Now it's smooth. And truthfully, I never exactly figured out what that problem was. I just kept doing it again until I got it right, till it felt right. There's just no point in starting stitching till you know that it's in there correctly. Okay, we're all set, ready to go. Maintenance is done. Let me just pack up my bits so I don't forget to take them home with me when I go. Get them out of the way. And I think we should take a minute now to have a look at yesterday's project. Brought along lots of things to show you, but we'll hang on to those for just a minute. So here's the quilt I was working on yesterday, the little Sunbonnet Sue. And we discussed a little bit, I'll pass this around in the room in just a moment. A couple of things we discussed yesterday were this idea that a lot of quilters are opposed to doing an edge-to-edge, all-over type quilting design over applique, because they think it's kind of a, I don't know, maybe a cop-out, a less than way of quilting it. So you guys form your own opinion. You don't have to give me it necessarily, but form your own opinion. Like, are you okay with that? I know that I am. I love this texture all over it. It's soft. When it gets washed, it's literally just going to be texture. You'll hardly even see the hibiscus flowers that I quilted. It suits this little comfy, cozy lap quilt that's apt to be a gift, and not a ton of time was spent quilting it, and to me it feels like the perfect fit. So we'll pass that around. Feel free to look at the back. You can see the quilting maybe a little better on the back. Right, the comment is that it doesn't detract from the design. I agree, and to me what makes that possible is the evenness of the texture, so you don't see the quilting, where if I were quilting, I don't know, things that had tight areas and loose areas, or things that had a picture in them, that your eye was trying to follow the picture, you know, a flower plus a girl holding a bouquet or something, I don't know. But this idea of just a texture then just fades into the background and becomes a supporting actor in the quilt. Anyway, I'm happy with it. Just a little side note, I do quilt for clients, and this is how I give the quilts back to them unless they specify otherwise. I offer to trim them, as I've done this one, so it's ready to bind. So as we were quilting yesterday, we were putting basting stitches all the way around that perimeter, so it's all nice and secure and straight. The corners are 90 degrees. So I just take it to my cutting table with my big ruler and rotary cutter and trim it up. It just so happens that I do a fair bit of quilting for elderly ladies who often, you know, can't get on the floor to do it, or don't have a table big enough to do it, or for whatever reason. So this is a service that I offer to my clients as part of the package, unless they request not. And some prefer to do their own. Maybe they want to wrap it around and use it for binding, or whatever the case may be. Okay, so while that is going around, I did bring some more fun things today, because I want to talk a little bit about why a person would want to do free motion quilting as opposed to other ways you could machine quilt. So maybe we should start by talking about some of those other ways. One of them would be a computerized system. That is certainly a way where the designs have already been dreamed up by somebody else, they've been programmed in, and your job is just to make them fit the quilt that you're working on and decide how small or how large you want the quilting spacing to be, and then the computer prints them or quilts them out on your project. So that's one option. Another option would be to use pantographs, which is kind of getting a little muddy in the quilting world. People are starting to call free motion quilting pantographs too, which is not quite true. Pantograph traditionally has been a paper pattern that you lay on the table of the long arm, and then you have a laser light and you stand with handlebars at the back side of the long arm and you follow with your laser light that printed pattern. And the machine is on the other side doing the stitching, but you're not really seeing the stitching as it happens, you're just following the pattern. Absolutely an option. There are thousands and thousands of patterns available, so you have that variety available to you at your fingertips, absolutely. And that's an option if you're totally uncomfortable winging it like I do. It's an option. But there are limitations, and the first limitation is you've got to acquire those paper patterns. They cost typically $15 to $17 per pattern. So if you want a variety of 100, right away, you've got $1,500 to $1,700 in patterns. You can find sales and things like that, but still it is going to be an investment just to get the pattern. Number two, you have to quilt at the wrong side of the machine. So there's quite a bit of technical, like lining up of patterns and making sure that where you're stitching is within the boundary of where you want to be on that quilt front. Like it's not just a matter of starting. There's quite a process. And when you advance the quilt, and then you've got to line up your new paper pattern and where you're drawing with what you did before, that's a fair-sized process and requires some real precision about it. So to me, when I first was introduced to quilting entirely free motion from the front of my machine, where I can see where the stitches are and adjust and change on the fly, it felt like a no-brainer. I was like, okay, if I can figure out the artistry of this and learn some things that I want to quilt, it's so much easier to quilt from the front of the machine. I can size it up and down just in my head as I'm quilting, right? I don't have to worry about buying the pattern in a different size. That's another thing about pantographs. If you want, you purchase this feather design, but now you want to make it twice as large, like bigger feathers, you've got to purchase another pattern. That's another thing. Everything is different and has to be added to your repertoire. Is there anything I can do on the mic, Dave? It's popping so badly. Lower to the side. We'll keep trying. I'm trying to make it as pleasant for you guys as I can. So to me, it felt like a no-brainer, and well, it just did. I'll pass around some samples. These are all things that are in my free motion quilting masterclass, which I've talked about a few times. These are all things that I have quilted freehand. This first one is one that I did use the aid of a grid. And I drew it because I was working on a solid piece of fabric, but typically I'll use designs like this when the patchwork lends to it, right? I've got 3-inch squares in a quilt, or 2-inch squares, or 4-inch squares. So that grid is drawn in the patchwork. So I don't draw outlines like this on a whole quilt. That's just did this for the purposes of this sample. But you can see this is fairly easy. I'm literally quilting an S-curve from point to point to point. So that's the kind of thing I don't have to purchase a pattern for, and I don't have to invest in a ruler for necessarily either. If I have a little control of my machine, I can literally do that freehand. Which one shall we look at next? We'll do flames next. This is a fun one. This design, and flames are not original to me. Other people have quilted flames and... Got it? Other people have quilted flames, and certainly you can purchase this as a pattern in various formats. But I looked at those patterns and thought, I can wing that. Yes, I can. And it so happened that the first quilt I was doing it on was a friend of mine made it, and it was a ginormous king-size t-shirt quilt, all Harley-Davidson t-shirts. And she had pieced in, some orange flying geese here and there, so it had that real flame feel. So it seemed like the perfect design. I've done it I did a quilt for one of my nephews, and he had like an Alexander McQueen, fast car kind of quilt, and that seemed suitable too. But when you look at this, you can see quickly how fairly simple it is to make this tiny little flames as a fill between things, or big flames. When I was doing my nephew's quilt, it was flannel, and they wanted, cozy and fluffy. And so I did the flames probably 50% bigger than this. But so easy to do, and just wing your way across a quilt. And I quilted that, by the way, with the flames running side to side. So that's how I moved across my quilting area. Then I brought a few floral ones. Oh, you'll recognize this one. We did this yesterday. So interestingly, a few of you were here late last night, and I was talking a little bit about the evolution of this hibiscus design. When I first began quilting it, it had much longer flower petals, much longer even than this one. They were long and thin. I kind of was thinking maybe coreopsis in my mind, or even daisy with those longer petals relative to the center. But what I found quickly is that it got difficult to nest them in each other when I had such long bits that I was quilting, right? It was harder to fit things in. So gradually over time, my petals got shorter and shorter and shorter till they were these short, plump little ones, much easier to manipulate and move around on my quilt. And gradually over time, I added the echo as well. It kind of sets off and finishes those flowers with a little bit of polish. And I did forget one housekeeping thing, particularly for those of you who are online. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them, and we'll take some pauses here and there and do it. But if you will put a QQ in front of your questions, then we can search for them easily and find them and come back to them. So yeah, this was yesterday's hibiscus, and it has evolved. And lots of my designs do that. Over time, I find a way that makes it easier to move around a quilt top, or a join from one to the next that I think is more graceful than what I had before. So they evolve over time, and I'm fine with that. This may change, and in another 5 years, the hibiscus may look altogether different again. This one is a very similar flower. I call this a plume, and you can see that it's a similar way that it's formed, a similar thread path to the hibiscus. All that's different is the shape of the petal. I've used just a feather shape around it, and I call it a plume. And with both of these, I can mess around with what's in the center. In other words, I can put just a simple hook, or I could put anything. I could put a little heart in the center if I wanted to, and put my petals around it. A spiral is what I do most often, but that's just my own personal style. You can edit them in that way. This is one of my favorites. I call this a whimsical rose. As you can see, super casual. It's not very formal at all. This forms wonderful, wonderful texture on quilts. Whenever, maybe when we're done today, we'll throw my screensaver up because it's a whole quilt done with this design. And even more than the hibiscus, it just provides this gorgeous layer of even texture, like fairly evenly spaced, and you don't even really see the roses. So then it totally doesn't matter if your quilting is sloppy or messy or whatever. Anyway, roses. And then the last one. This is also one of my favorites. My personal style happens to be, I like to repeat a thing and learn how to do it well and do it over and over again. So this suits me, this quilting in rows and getting really systematic and very precise about the repeats in it. I get asked all the time, isn't that computerized? No, it's not. This is absolutely freehand. And it is one of the lessons that I teach in my, or the designs that I teach in my freehand quilting masterclass too, because I do have some tips for doing that, how to keep them upright, how to keep them evenly spaced. So there are some tricks to that, but it's not magic. It is simply a matter of practice, exactly like handwriting, and learning some of those tips about posture and so forth. So I call those crazy eights. I love them on more modern quilts, more contemporary quilts. Just looks great. Okay, one more, and this one I'm going to use both this morning and this afternoon because it has examples of both. This little quilt is called String Theory, and I made this for Dave when he was turning 50. He comes from a very musical family, and guitar is kind of his first instrument, but as you can see, there's a piano keyboard in there, there's a bass clef, a treble clef, all representative of his background and the music that has been a thread in our family all these years. The scrappy little guitar, those scraps are a collection of, well, let's see, our oldest son is 33, so at least 33 years of family. Some of his earliest little PJs that I made for him, aprons that I've had, sundresses that the girls have had, all of those are represented in the scrappy bits in the guitar. So that was kind of the inspiration behind it. But just notice the quilting as it comes around. Take a look at the quilting. You'll see some ruler work, which we'll be talking about more this afternoon. But a lot of my fills were free motion too. Here's the little plume up here, done in a smaller size. I just scaled that way down so they were tiny. Sorry, I'm brushing up against the mic. What else would we recognize in here? I mean, down here I've got some very simple swirls, but all I did to fill in this quilt was, with my marking pen, I kind of drew areas that I thought divided it up gracefully-ish, And then I filled different things in each one. And I contrasted the straight lines against the curvy things, right? So that they kind of are, there's a bit of separation, or they catch your eye a little bit. And it was just that simple. And then I just worked my way through those areas. Okay, what shall I put in that one? What shall I put in this one? And on down the quilt. I'm trying to remember. Let's see. How many years ago was your 50th birthday, Dave? I know. I would have made this in about my second or third year of machine quilting. And I'll be honest with you guys, I get asked all the time, how long have you been quilting? You must have been quilting for a long time. I'm not yet to 10 years. That comes in, I think, February. But really, it's not the length of time, it's the number of quilts, and kind of it's your fearlessness too. I think it was Tammy I was talking to yesterday who was kind of laughing, like, I just dive in. I'm a person who bites off way more than I can chew. So am I. However, I don't regret that, and I don't try and talk myself out of that, because that's how I've done my most fun projects, is it catches my eye and my interest and my passion, and I just say, I'm gonna do it. And I'll figure out how as I go. And by the time I'm done, I've learned a lot. Is it sometimes frustrating in the middle or terrifying, or you think, oh my word, I'm gonna make a real mess of this? Absolutely. Also, is it very rewarding, and some of my best projects like that one came from that. Okay, so today we are actually going to quilt another project. It is smaller than yesterday's, but to me that feels like the best way to illustrate some of the things we've been talking about. So I'll go over some of the things we discussed yesterday, and then we're going to do a simple free motion design that I think any of you could take home and quilt this afternoon. So there's that. Also, I brought, this is a client quilt. My good friend Pris, and I do a lot of quilting for her. She was one of the first people that believed in me and had me machine quilt for her. This is how her quilts come to me. So if you're thinking of doing it for a business, or if you hire a long armer, take some ideas from this. But if you're thinking of doing it for other people, she ties her bits all together with just a little piece of selvage. And of course, I always stop and look, is that a selvage that I want to save? Because I do projects with selvages, and you'll get to see one this afternoon. And then she puts little notes on it. So often it will say top, because maybe her back has kitty cats on it or balloons or something like that, and she wants it to be directional. And I so appreciate that, because it seems self-evident what part of the quilt is up, but you wouldn't believe how often how easy it is to miss that. So I do ask my clients, like, this is all I need, piece of paper that says this side up, or has, I want something swirly, or whatever the case may be. So in her case, she put, it's square, so no top. So that was nice. That lets me know I don't need to look for a top edge. And I appreciate that. Let's see, what have we got? Pris often does a pieced backing. So I thought, in light of our conversation yesterday about pieced backings and seams on them, that this would be fun. She does a lot of baby quilts, and she makes them for her local NICU. So they're often, 40 to 42 inches, so that she can use a width of backing fabric, but sometimes it's not long enough. So she'll use fabrics that were in the front too and put in strips like this. She does it all kinds of intricate ways, but just anything that will, A, use up her scrappy bits, and B, make that backing a little bigger without having to buy another half yard or whatever of fabric. And as you can see, she gets them nice and flat. She does not press her seams open on the back. That's fine. In they go. And it's a very simple little quilt. Like so. That would be custom quilting, that's correct. So in case anyone in the room is not familiar with the terms edge to edge or custom, let's define those quick. Custom quilting is where you're doing specific things in specific areas. So maybe in different blocks, or as I did in that one, certain things in the guitar in separate areas in that background fill. Or custom quilting might be something like doing something different in borders, or multiple thread changes of colors. Anything that adds a little fussy element to it. That's custom quilting. And edge to edge, or all over, they both mean the same thing, is literally that, the same type of quilting from one edge of the quilt to the other edge of the quilt. You don't stop for seams or borders or thread color changes or design changes, you just quilt the whole design. So the one that we did yesterday, the Sunbonnet Sue, that was an edge to edge. The one I'm going to do today, edge to edge, going to quilt the same thing from side to side. And of course that's the most economical. Yes, questions? So the question is, do I,
This one has so many different ones.
right,
Little circles with that.
right. So we're talking about the guitar quilt that I held up a moment ago. And the question is, do I plan out where those are going to be and how much I'm going to do in each one? Have I got that right? Okay, so clearly the guitar was an outline for what I was putting within those areas. But for the background that's around it, I did very loosely plan it in advance. And by loosely, I mean I took my marking utensil, it was probably an air erase pen, and I just loosely marked out areas, and they probably had curvy edges. So I was like, this area, and this area, and this area, and then I tried to contrast what I was putting in them. So there's a really swirly one against one that's more line-based, just so that they show up against each other. And I tried to keep those joins always curved and organic, so they weren't, you know, triangles of areas, they were just a sweep of areas. That's how much planning I did.
And then figure out, because you know the size of this, so you gotta figure out how many of what things you can fill that.
So talking about figuring out how many things I was filling, honestly, I didn't. I just started in my marked area, and take the swirls, for example. I just quilted swirls till I had filled in that area, and I wasn't hyper precise about the outside line of it. It was just a general guideline for how far my swirls went. And then once the swirls were filled in, then I maybe filled in a crosshatch next to them, and then went on to the next thing. One thing I probably did is the straight line things, like the crosshatching, probably came after the curly areas, just because how would you know where to stop the crosshatch? So easier to do the swirls here and the bubbles there, and then fill the crosshatch between them, right? So I would have thought that through first, yeah. And sometimes I'll just literally doodle on my fabric, like swirly, and then a couple crosshatch, put a little hashtag in there, and you just to give myself an idea of here's what I'm gonna do there, and here's what I'm gonna do here. And sometimes I do that on paper in advance, but not usually. I'm a bit of the fly by the seat of the pants. So wondering where things will fit or how many things to put in, I would have had that little quilt assembled. So I knew the full size of it. And because that one is so small, I could literally see the whole thing on my long arm. Like it kind of draped over the front, but I could see the whole thing to determine, you know, I want my swirls to cover about this much and my crosshatch about this much. That's how I do it. It's not very scientific. Another question? Correct. The quilt that I did yesterday does not have a bound edge yet. I probably won't. It belongs to my sister, so she'll probably do that, and mostly my clients too. I give it back to them and they do that binding. Correct. Correct. Yes. So my part just extends as far as trimming it, neatening it up, and then they'll take it home and put whatever binding they choose on it. Okay. So the question is, did it take me a long time from when I first began quilting to be able to do something like the guitar quilt? Knowing when Dave's 50th birthday was helps me get a time frame in there, so I must have done that in about my 3rd year of quilting. So I wouldn't say I was terribly experienced yet by then, but I'm not shy about just diving in and trying something. Looking at pictures, saying, I like that, I don't like that one, so I won't use that fill. I like the swirls, I like the crosshatch, I'm gonna put them in. And to give it a little bit maybe more detailed perspective, at that point I was quilting something like 100 quilts a year. So I would have been at like 200 to 250 quilts that I had quilted at that point. So maybe that gives you a better idea. Like if you're quilting at home only on your own things and you're just doing 5 in a year, it's going to take you more than 3 years to get to that point. Nevertheless, don't be scared of trying. If it catches your imagination and you want to try it, just do it. That's my 2 cents. Another question? This is a super question. Did I have formal education on starting to quilt? I took 1 class at my local shop on quilting at a domestic machine. So I grew up alongside my mom hand quilting. So I knew about making quilts and fabric, and I knew, for example, that quilting on a diagonal line always looks better than quilting with the straight of grain. I knew those sorts of things already. So I went and took this one class on machine quilting on a domestic machine, and I learned things like practicing L's and practicing E's and getting rhythmic and making a quilt sandwich and basting things together. And then I started quilting. So since then, I have at different times taken classes like at quilt shows. There'll be a teacher I admire that's teaching, and I'll take a class from her and learn a little bit more. I watch YouTube like all of you guys do, and I pick up tips and hints here and there, and that's it. Certainly, I have no formal art training. I can't draw my way out of a wet paper sack. Nothing like that. I quilt way better than I draw. That has always been true. By the way, it's 11:11. Make a wish. Okay, let's get started on today's quilt. It's so easy to confuse what is the front and the back because they're both so cute. Okay, apparently there are a couple of questions online. I should take a moment and take those. And if you wouldn't mind passing me my bottle of water, I really need. There's another one. I have several bottles of water on the go. I'm getting very parched. Tammy is asking, do you use 40 weight thread? Yes, I do. And after we've finished a couple questions, I will say a little bit more about thread before we go further. Teresa, I should have asked yesterday, when quilting a large quilt, how do you keep the batting from crinkling or folding in the center? So if you were watching when I showed the advance portion, and I think it was early in the afternoon session, when I roll the quilt up to advance it, I walk along the front and I grasp the quilt and the batting and I give it tug, 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 tug all the way across. Because batting does have a tendency somehow to ride up in the middle. And I think actually its tendency is to stretch out on the edges. And so if you don't manage that with each advance, you will end up with batting that's got fullness squunched in the middle. So you're kind of combating that wanting to stretch tendency. Next one. Okay. Pam, did you feel like you didn't have control of your machine at first? I feel like I'm too far away from the needle to have control. Absolutely I did, Pam. That's been an ongoing learning curve. But also to this day, when I'm doing something that's highly detailed, like some of the little bubbles, for example, on that guitar quilt, I'll make sure it's in an area that's close to me and not quilting way out here at arm's length, because you just can't see as well. I also keep my machine quite high, so that makes me not able to see as well far away, too. So then I just make sure that that is closer to me, even if I need to rewind the quilt a little bit, and that makes it a bit easier. There we go. Tammy, if you quilted something in a wrong direction, would you pick the whole quilt out? Well, I'm not sure what you mean by wrong direction. I don't think I've ever undone a whole quilt. I've undone sections for the reason of poor tension on the back. I do not let client quilts go out of my studio with yucky tension in the back. I would undo for that reason if that happened. I don't think I've ever undone because I wasn't in love with the effect of the quilting. I just chalk that up to experience. Now I know what I like or don't like. Might make a different decision next time. Call it good. That's it for those questions. Okay, could you pass me that thread box if you would, Dave? The little Stitched by Susan thread box. I mentioned this ever so briefly yesterday, but I'm going to talk about it a little more today. This is a one-off because I ordered one box for a sample, one cardboard box. And I filled it for the people that are in the class. Later today, I'm going to be giving away this box that has 12 of my favorite Isacord 40 weight threads. Now, it's not a very thrilling collection of color, but these are some of the basics that are honestly my favorite, that are just my go-to. I go back to them and go back to them. There's an eggshell, there's a pale silver, there's a darker mid-gray, and a charcoal. Do you see a theme here? Grays are great blenders. There's a nice robin's egg blue that I love. There's a caramel one, which is a lovely warm color that you can use on a lot of browns and even into some deep creams. Very versatile threads. A couple of teals. I love teal. A nice navy. So this little collection will be drawn from someone that's in attendance today. But these are the same threads that I typically use on my machine, just in the smaller spool size, so that I could fit 12 in this little box. Okay, on to, oh, we've got a comment. Susan Berry, I'm jealous, I want one. Got to come to a class, just saying. Okay, we're going to load our little baby quilts, and let me make sure I get it rectangular. And I want to talk just a little bit about my loading mechanism. So I'm here at Stitch House in Richardson, Texas, and they don't have these in the store, so I'm only going to talk very briefly about it. But these are a favorite, and if you watch my YouTube episodes, you'll have seen me using them. There's a shop in, I think, Utah called Quilts on the Corner, and Renee, the owner, invented these snappers. Now, I've got to be 100% honest, too, and say her initial invention is called the red snappers, and that's what I use at home on my machine. What I've got here today is a knockoff, and I'm almost embarrassed to show it. But what happened is someone gave me these, and I did not feel guilty about chopping them up into pieces small enough to fit in my suitcase, so it has become my travel edition. They don't feel as great. They're not as flexible as the original Real Thing. And I do have a link for the Real Thing below the description of my YouTube episodes. But here's how they work. This simple little rod is in the hem of my long arm. So right here in this hem for the bottom side of my backing, and right here in this hem for the top side of it. And then the snapper bit just snaps right over it. I have yet to find a faster loading system. There are people that love the So-Tight magnets. There are lots of people that use pins, both absolutely fine ways. But I have yet to find a way that's faster, honestly, than these. I think I said it yesterday. I can consistently load a queen size quilt in 10 minutes. I think I did a video of it the other day and it was just under 7. So we're talking fast. And I love that. Like, I don't want to spend a ton of time loading. So that's what I'm using today too. All right, so let's load this front side. And remember, as I showed yesterday, there's really no need to measure the center of this backing or to center it on the long arm rails. It really doesn't matter to me. I just need a straight edge. And this happens to be, quite a bit of this is actually selvage. On all the white areas, it's selvage. So I'm confident that that is straight. I should mention this too. This is a little bit rectangular, and I'm loading it long ways across because I'll probably be able to quilt it in 2 passes, maybe. We'll see. I think actually Pris said the quilt is square, so the truth is it probably doesn't matter which way I load it. But the backing is a little bit rectangular. So you see how quick these little snappers are. You just hold the edge of the quilt nice and straight, lined up with the hem of that leader, snap the top edge on. Good to go. And in my big proper set, there is, in addition, some short little pieces, and that's where I would use for a little lip like this. But in today's case, I don't have any, so I will just put a long one on. This is a very small quilt, so we're not dealing with very much backing, but I want to show you guys one other thing. I showed you yesterday that I often will just take a spray bottle, a light mist of water, to my backing that will relax any creases that are in it, but there is an additional way. Different people have different uses for different products in their sewing room, but one that I want to highlight today is a Laura Star steamer. I don't actually have this at home. I have a Laura Star iron, which we're going to be talking about this afternoon, but watch this. Pretty crazy. And what's cool about the steamer is it's this little lift set on a stand, and the water tank is in that lift. So the first steam is made there, and it is also diffused in the hose so that by the time it comes out, it's super, super fine. So the goal is you don't get a spray on your quilt, you get a misting. So it is always important to let off a little steam before you head to your quilt because that first burst is quite wet. And this little lift, of course, rolls around. They come with a pretty long cord, so this is another way that you can take the wrinkles out of your backing. And they just disappear. If you happen to be a garment sewer, oh my word. These are amazing for, pressing your sleeves or pressing really persistent folds out of fabric that's been on a bolt for a long time. This burst of superfine steam is just marvelous. Pardon me?
Laura Star.
Laura Star is the brand. Yep, and we will be talking about it more this afternoon. Jackie's going to show us the ironing board and that whole system, all by Laura Star. Also a good sauna. Just for a multi-purpose tool. Great facial, yes, exactly. I do use it, this is a little side note, I use my iron. It's on a lift like this, but it has the iron attachment instead of the steamer. And I use it to make my binding, and I've got a little contraption that kind of screws onto my ironing table, and I feed my binding through, and so then I just set my iron with the steam, and I just pull my binding out, and then I just sit there and soak up the sun. It's hysterical. Okay, back to our quilting. I'm going to give you that for just a moment. So we've got a very small quilt at play here today, but the same process as I did yesterday. I've just flipped it over the back rail, and I want it to be straight over the back rail. So I don't want to pull it to one side or the other, right? We remember that. We don't want any of that angular look in it. We want to be sure it rolls on straight. And I do have quite a few seams in this one. You know, maybe it would have been wiser to load it the other way, but I was attracted to that nice selvage edge on this side. So I will have to watch those seams that they stay straight and don't pull tighter. It's always a little different roll doing this on someone else's machine. No, that is right. I want that latched. I do this without thinking at my machine at home. There we go. So I can see the bottom edge of my quilt and the bottom edge of that leader, and I'm just rolling till they're almost lined up. And then I walk around to the back side and put my snappers on there as well. And I talked yesterday about my magnets that I like to use on the front of the machine. I also keep one at the back of my table, and I usually put it on right here to act just like a pin so this doesn't inadvertently fall off. It probably won't on such a tiny quilt, but on the big quilt sometimes it does. And then I just work my way along, snapping my snappers. Hey, do you want to look in my bags back there? I did not remember to get out my piece of batting. You should see my batting. I was trying to think of so many things this morning. I think that's it. We'll double check. In the interests of measuring twice and cutting once, we'll hold the batting up and we'll hold the quilt against it to make sure we've got a big enough one. Where did I put the quilt? Right here. Look at that. Perfect. Okay. So let's roll this on a little further. I think I mentioned briefly yesterday, I will again today. On my machine at home, my wheel is on the same end as my ratchets. So I mentioned that to Elias here, and he's going to shift that, because of course it's much easier to not have to trot back and forth. I think that's about tight enough. I do not want a drum, remember? We learned that yesterday. Batting comes next, and today I'm using just the all-purpose 80-20 batting. And more than likely, this is a piece that came, you know, my rolls come 120 inches wide, so often I'll take a lap quilt off the side, and then I can get a baby quilt or two from what remains. So I keep those bits. Lay my batting on, and I don't worry about right side and wrong side with the 80-20. It does not seem to matter. I've not had any trouble with it, so I just put it on. So I'm visually centering my quilt. You know, that just, it depends honestly on the quilt I'm working on. The one I did yesterday had quite a bit of extra on both sides. And often with those at home, I'll literally put the quilt closer to one side so I have one nice chunk, usable chunk left over. That's just up to you with each quilt. You know, take that into consideration. This one does not have a ton of excess on both sides, so I am going to center it. All right, and we're ready to baste. So, using once again our stitch regulator is on, we're going to use our basting stitch. My personal favorite is 1/4 inch, so I've got 4 stitches to the inch. Oh, I've got 2 stitches to the inch. I like 4 better. And I just have an eggshell thread on here again. You know, certainly this is a quilt where you could play with the thread colors if you wished. You could use a blue. You could use any color you want to. I feel like using the red or the green or even the dark blue would be quite stark on the white portions, but that's just my personal preference. So I've basted up the left side. I'm basting across the top. All of this just acts to secure my whole quilting area so that it can't shift when I begin to put the quilting in place. If I have a quilt that's got a lot of wonkiness, like for example, a border that's got some fullness and waviness in it, and I know that I've got to deal with that, I will sometimes take the time to put some pins in and, you know, establish the middle and then the quarters, and then I can work with that fullness as I'm working my way across. But this little one is nice and flat, so I did not take any time to pin it. And my basting line, if you recall from yesterday, I try to keep within a 1/4 inch of the edge of the quilt so that it does not have to be undone at the end. It will just fall inside that finishing binding near the end. Little tiny side note. I noticed when I was basting that my thread was kind of flashing. So right away I look up and say, what's the scoop? Why am I seeing that? I don't usually see that. And I can see right here it has popped out of the one thread guide. This comes under the heading of know your machine. There's just so many little things like that, which if you're just paying attention when you're sewing, you'll know if it's out of the ordinary. If I left that, chances are I might start getting skipped stitches or poor tension, and I might not be able to figure out why. But now that I see that, I can just quickly correct that. Easy peasy. Now, ordinarily, I would put my magnets on the front rails, holding this front edge still. I don't have my magnets with me because they were very heavy to bring on the plane, so I didn't do that. But you do have other options. You can lay a row of pins in the front. You can put C-clamps along the front. I could even have run another basting line right across the front, but that will have to get undone. So I'm going to do the same thing I did yesterday and just drop in a few pins. Just enough to keep this fabric from pulling upwards as I'm quilting across. Also, it gives me a guideline for how far forward I can quilt, right, without running into that front rail. So my pins just give me a visual reminder of that. Okay, we have a question. Question where, hun? Question here? Sorry.
I noticed that you used, yesterday, you used like hat pins rather than quilting pins or
Okay.
the smaller straight pins.
Yes. So Tammy noticed yesterday that I was using hat pins. They're actually corsage pins, but about the same thing. Don't know if you can see them on camera. This one's got a crooked head. Look at that. All it is, you need extra sturdy pins. So your average sewing pin is going to bend when you try to do things like this, like putting through the layers and getting the pin to come back up. So corsage pins are a pretty affordable way to go. Hobby Lobby has sales all the time on them. I think hat pins are longer, but they're very similar. But same idea, just a good strong pin. Some of the pins you get with flower heads work too. T-pins work too. Anything that's a little more robust. Okay, we're basted. I'm going to go ahead and put my side clamps on. I'll put in here as a side note. The side clamps, again, are just achieving the goal of keeping your quilting surface from being able to pull out of shape, right? The larger your quilt, the more important all of that is, because there's sort of more fabric, more places to go wrong. But I'm going to be honest with you. When I do a quilt this tiny, I often will just quilt it. It's so small, I can see what's happening. There's so little chance of that backing actually puckering up. But because I am showing you all the process today, I'm going to go ahead and put the clips on. They are just one more insurance, if you will. Here's the one difficulty that I see. They're quite bulky, right? And I have very little leeway at the side. So what's going to happen is I'm apt to bump into those at the side. Can you guys see that in the room? The nose of my long arm under here. So again, this is a tip that you can easily do at home. I use yardsticks, but you can use a curtain rod, anything long and straight. And I literally put them under these strings and lift them up. And that just lifts this out of the way where I can now move freely without bumping them. Does that make sense? So that's a super easy fix. So I've now changed my mind about the side clamps. I'm not going to put them on because if I bump into them, I'm going to get square circles. That's what's going to happen, right? So I'm just weighing in my mind how important it is to keep that pulled snug versus how important it is to not bump into them. And I've come down on this side of not clamping it. Question in the back.
I noticed today and yesterday you did not do a horizontal straight line to get your quilt on straight. Are you eyeballing it, or is it because you're doing free motion? What is your thought theory on that?
So the question is, why did I not do that on the batting first? Is that kind of what you're thinking, to establish that straight line on the top? I'm kind of taking that shortcut based on my level of experience. I can eyeball that quilt pretty straight. I've got my red snappers, which are a straight line about 1.5 inches away to judge by, and I call that good enough. I consistently can get my quilts within 1/4 inch of square, and I'm satisfied with that. So that's my rationale. Okay, ready to start quilting? Today, to be different, I'll start in the top left corner. I told you guys yesterday, for whatever reason, I tend to land on starting in the top right corner, but the truth is it does not matter. We're going to alternate as we roll our quilt up, so it doesn't matter which corner you start in, but certainly start in the far corner. So I still have my stitch regulator on. I'm in BSR 1, which means when I move, it speeds up, but when I hold still, it still stitches, it coasts. So like this. I'm stitching and then I hold still and the needle still goes. Okay, that's what BSR 1 does. And it's the most common one that I use. And this is our simple quilting design for today. Loops. Many of them will be double loops, but we'll also tuck in some single loops. So I'm serious when I say this is the design that you can take home and quilt tonight if you want to. So let me know how it's showing up on camera. I'm sure some colors will show up better than others. Dave, can I turn this a little to make the needle be... I'm trying to gently turn the camera for those of you who are watching online. Is that too much? Trying to find a fine balance between you being able to see in front of the needle and being able to see some of the quilting when it's done. Okay, let's proceed. And we talked a bit yesterday about how I move more or less diagonally across the quilt to fill it. So you'll see that now. I'm going to go and fill in this area on my left-hand side, leaving the area very closest to me a little less quilted, and getting the area far from me very full. This again helps me not get myself quilted into a corner and keeps these circles from ending up all in a row, because I want them to be very organic. So I don't want to quilt them in rows either up and down like columns or rows from left to right. So this just helps me keep it switched up. So again, I am frequently doing the double loop, but anywhere I don't have quite enough space for a double one, I can just simply drop in a single one. See how fast this goes? I'm going to stop for just a second and point out a couple things so you can see them then before I finish. This is like a miniaturized version of my freehand quilting masterclass. There are a few tips that come into play when I'm working on an idea for a free motion design, like how am I going to quilt this? How do I make this repeatable, something I can remember, something I can lay down on a quilt top? Okay, a few things that I look for. One is it easy to move from one motif to the next? I mean, for your loops, that's pretty true. And by the way, this is the first design that I teach in the master class. So is it easy to move around on the quilt top? Yes, it is. Another one is I need a way, always in my back pocket, for getting myself out of a bind or for filling in a tiny corner. So those double loops are pretty big. They're about 3 inches. Well, what happens if I only have a 2-inch space? What am I going to put in there? And my answer to that is always have something small that goes with each design. So like yesterday when I was doing the hibiscus, it might be a single swirl from the center, or it might be a single petal or 2 petals. But today with the double loops, it's a single loop. So I've got that solution in the back of my mind, and because I put it in there here and there fairly frequently, it just becomes part of that cohesive design as a whole. So that's just a great tip. No matter what your design is that you're working on, flowers, hearts, leaves, have a smaller version or a partial version or something that's complementary that you can tuck into the odd corners. So you'll see that as I'm finishing up working in a square corner with round loops, there's inevitably going to be places that I need to fill in. Oh yes, camera again. It just I think it's wobbling, Mr. Producer, is what it's doing. Because it keeps shifting. Okay, so we're finished one pass. We're not going to get it quite in 2. It's going to be 3. But is that kind of making sense? Are you able to see it a little bit better on camera today with the colors to kind of get some sense of where I'm moving? Yeah, I'm happy with that. How long do we think we're going to stay on air? 20 minutes or so? Let me just look at my list of things to talk about again. Okay, let's talk a couple minutes before I go back to quilting and do my advance. A few things that are happening here at Stitch House, because we're here in person today in a shop, right? And Jessica alluded to this a moment ago. The Black Friday sales are starting. Today is the first day. So Bernina has issued a ton of sales and special prices, and I don't even know all those details, so I'm not going to run down through them for you. I just know it's a great opportunity for some of these things, both machine-wise, some of the accessories and the bundles that Stitch House has made for you that are over on the sale table, and then things like the Laura Star, some of those accessories that sometimes might be out of reach, and there's some really, really good sales on right now. There's just, I talked about this a bit yesterday, and I'll underline it again. I've been driving my Bernina machine now for just under 2 years, and I came from a Gamel. And I want to just be clear, there are many good long arms out there, and my Gamel was one of them. It served me super, super well. But there were specific things about the Bernina that really attracted me that might be of interest to you guys. And one of them certainly was the fact that it uses the sewing machine needles and uses the sewing machine feet. So those things being interchangeable allow me just to have less equipment and less guesswork in that process and give me more flexibility, like being able to use a top stitch needle or a jeans needle or that twin needle. Have you guys ever seen a twin needle? Do you even know what that is? So a twin needle is like a double, it's got one shank on it, but a double pronged needle, and you run 2 threads in it and 1 bobbin thread, and the bobbin thread zigzags, but on the top you literally get a ribbon. So you can quilt a ribbon with one thread path. It's very, very cool. You can put 2 different threads in it and get this twisting, you know, red and a pink. It's just very cool. So I was attracted to that quality of having this flexibility. A lot of the long arms tend to be, I want to say institutional, that's not the word I want, but like commercial applications. So they don't have bells and whistles, pardon me? Industrial, that's the word I want, Mr. Producer, to the rescue. They often don't have some of those fine artsy features, and the Bernina has done a great job of straddling both worlds. They have a machine that is industrial quality engineering, but still has the fineness, the delicacy, the precision of your sewing machine, which some industrial quilting machines don't have. So I love that about it, and I'll reiterate again what I said yesterday, and I totally believe it to be true. For your buck, the Bernina has superior value. There are, you know, higher end machines out there, more costly machines out there, and there are lower end machines out there, and absolutely you should shop for your budget. But even within the Bernina world, as Jessica said earlier, that big machine, the quilting machine on a table for $59.99 is incredible. Like, I don't know where else you'll find that. That's less than a lot of our sewing machines are. So if that's something that you want to get into, that's a great entry point. So remember that a machine exactly like the one that I'm using can also fit on a table. So if you want to get into, you know, get your feet wet a little bit first, you can not dive into the big frame. And we do still have the mat here somewhere. Mr. Producer rolled it up. But we do have the mat here that Jessica had yesterday. If any of you want to see it rolled out again, we can certainly do that for you, because it gives you the exact footprint of these different frames and machines and what they look like in your home. One I don't think we've talked about is this studio frame has an option of a 5-foot setup. So these long poles are actually, they do split in the middle. So that's how it's done. I'm not sure if you get the 10-foot when you purchase or if you have to choose. But anyway, all it is you get half that width, but all the same apparatus goes on both ends. So if you're really strapped for space, that's an option too. Just know that you are then also limited to about a 50-inch quilting space too. So lots of options out there certainly to look at. I encourage you guys to have a look over here at the table. I was rummaging in this yesterday, and I was like a good girl and put the fabrics back. But I may come back again because I see they're all still here. See, this is Susan's stack right here. But there's so many fun fat quarters in here to rummage through, and some of the specials they've got listed, like the one with the bottles at the side. You've got a paper at your table that states the bundle. You get that little bit that's packaged plus your choice of a grouping of fat quarters. So there's lots of fun things here. Browse and shop in them. But let's talk for a few more minutes quilting before we do our lunch break. I think we'll go ahead and advance. Are you adjusting cameras? I'm sorry? Okay, we have some questions online. There's a great time for those. We got a lot of things going on today. Jennifer, yesterday you talked about issues with a small batting after you've started quilting. How do you add a bit to make up the difference? So I did do it here for the in-house crowd, but I will tell you, I do have previous YouTube episodes that cover that, splicing batting. If you Google that on my channel, you'll find them. It basically involves layering your batting, cutting with a wavy line, and then butting them up against each other. Super easy, does not take very much time at all. Carrie, would this be a good design to practice manual mode? I don't think there's a bad design to practice manual mode. In fact, I can do the next pass manual mode if you like so that you can see it, but absolutely yes. It is also, if you're a semi-experienced quilter, it's also a good one to have it on the stitch regulator, but be practicing keeping the sound as even as you can. That can be another tool for helping yourself get smooth in your quilting. So I'll talk about both of those when I'm quilting again the next time. How's that? More questions? Noreen, can you talk about batting having scrim versus needle punched? Is it the same, and why do you need scrim? I've got to tell you honestly, I'm not a super expert on all kinds of batting because I tend to have my favorites and use them repeatedly. So I would tend to ask a batting expert. For example, with Hobbs, Steph Hackney is online. You can DM her in Instagram and she'll answer your specific question. She's really good about that. Scrim is an actual film, like a thin netting that's applied on the back side of the batting. Needle punch is just a bajillion needles pressing down through and kind of poking those layers together. So that is the difference. I don't know all the pros and cons. I just honestly don't. Nadine again, or a different Nadine. I followed you a while but can't afford the big course. Would you consider publishing a book with the quilt designs you've done free videos on? It's easier to flip through a book than search videos, which I can totally appreciate. But there's only one of me, Nadine, so I hope I hope you can appreciate that. At this point, I've chosen to put my effort into producing videos and online courses and not to write a book. Yes?
Quick question. When you're doing your pattern, and I know this is probably just practice, but how do you make sure that you're not kind of doing the same, you know, like going in the same so that your bubbles are all kind of up and or instead of down and across, you know what I'm saying?
So Phaedra's kind of asking, how do I make sure that they're not in a row or that they're in different directions?
Going sometimes, then you're circling and then you're coming over here and then you go back up and it's the same thing. You're like, okay, that's this all the
Yeah.
way across
Yeah.
instead of more random.
Yes.
So how are you maybe mentally making sure that you're not doing the same pattern if you're kind of trying to be organic?
Right. So if I'm trying to keep the movement random and organic, I don't want to be repeating in rows or columns or doing the same direction over and over
Sometimes when
again.
you're just kind of doing the motions.
Yeah.
That for me,
Yeah.
I kind of
A ton of that does come with practice. I know I have students who literally make mantras for themselves. You know, in, out, left, in, out, right. So that might be an option. My head doesn't work that way, but I'll throw that out there. One of them certainly is the idea of working in a diagonal fashion so that it keeps me from going one and then another that are the same. That right away starts to break that up. When I'm doing this loopy design in particular, I'm always trying to curve. Even my connectors, you know, I never go from one loop and straight into another loop, if that makes sense. I'm always reverse curving.
how are you making sure that your reverse curve, that, I mean, 'cause isn't that kind of a pattern in itself?
Is the reverse curve a pattern in itself?
Sometimes when you do, like the S's or maybe I can just stop.
You and I should sit and draw together.
You know what I'm saying? Yeah, I mean, I can see some of my drawings and it's kind of like, okay, that's.
Honestly, why don't we do that like over the lunch break or at the end of this class after we've gone off camera? We'll sit and draw a little bit. Yeah, sometimes it's hard to put in words the things that I'm just doing while I'm at the machine. And certainly some of it comes with doing it in the same way that your handwriting, you know, you might have long up swoops and loops and the next person might have short plump ones. Yours will probably never look just like mine. So I can show you mine a million times and yours might not come out identical. At some point you're just going to have to quilt them and sort of find your own happy place in the loops.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, is that the all online, Mr. Producer? We're good? Okay, let's go ahead and advance then. Oh, okay, I missed it, I'm sorry.
When you have a quilt come in, like they didn't have an idea of what pattern they want to use, how do you decide the pattern you're going to use?
Mhm.
Is it the number of patterns you have for the day or size?
So the question is, if a quilt comes to me as this one did with no specific discussion or instructions of what pattern to quilt, how do I decide? What influences that? So a few things. Number one, I always talk it over with the client. I always do. Even if they say to me, quilt whatever you want on it. I'm like, okay, but that's not good enough. I need to know, do you like swirly things? Or, because inevitably, I'll say to them, well, what about the all over feather? Oh, I hate feathers. Okay, well then you might want to specify that, right? So I at least try to get, even when they say, quilt whatever you want, I try and get some sense of their style. Do you want whimsical? Do you want formal? Do you want heirloom? Like, what do you want it to look like? So that's where I begin. In the case of this quilt coming from my friend Pris, I've done tons of quilts for her over time, and mostly she'll just say to me, quilt whatever you like on it, and I know her taste because we've worked together a lot. This is one of her favorite designs. But sometimes she'll say to me, I really want something specific for this one, or she'll say, give me some ideas and let me choose. And the way I do that, I don't have one here to show you, but I have plexiglass boards that are 18 inches by 24 that I can literally lay on a quilt, draw on with a dry erase marker, snap a picture, send to a client. And I can say, how about this one or this one or this one? And they can say, yes, yes, no. You know, and that helps to narrow it down. So those are some of the ways that I approach that. Okay, rolling our quilt up. And you notice that I've just left the long arm in, and I do keep wanting to call her Stella, because that's the name of mine. And I just leave the needle down and go ahead and roll the quilt, and it just rolls forward with it. So once again, with my tightening of the rail, I've left my quilt not terribly tight, right? Like I can grab my fingers all the way down to the knuckles underneath that. It's flat, but it's not pulled. And I still walk across the front, grabbing my quilt and my batting and giving that a nice little tug, making sure this edge is not stretching out, right? Sometimes I even pull that edge up a little bit. You can usually see at this front end, because it's floating, you can see if it starts getting wavy in the middle, you're like, oh, I've got to more aggressively get those edges pulled up in there, right? So I make those adjustments every time I do an advance. I'm assessing that. Are my seams running straight? Is my batting flowing smooth? Is my bottom edge straight? All the things, right? And make adjustments as needed each time. Put our basting stitch on. And I see just a touch of fullness in this edge, so I'm just feeding it under a little bit faster with my fingers. It's not much. It's not going to be very noticeable. It's not going to be noticeable at all, actually. But just that idea of management of fullness and flatness with every pass, that is key. My little pin basting, we're just moving that down. Should really have one more pin. So I talked yesterday about the programmable buttons. Now that you've seen me quilting quite a bit, I'll run through that again just so that you see what a difference that can make. I've got on my right hand side, because I'm right-handed, I've got my number 1 button as my stop start. So I push it once and my machine is on. See, the stitch regulator lights are on and it's in action. I press it again to stop. That action is so automatic in my head, I don't even think about it. The beauty of it is when I go into any store that has Berninas, I can in a second tell the machine that's what I want that button to do. And then when I leave, the store can, in a second, put it back to whatever way they want it. And it's just so easy to do. That matters to me because I'm so systematic about it, and I don't want to have to think about it. If I were to leave it wrong, I'd be pushing the wrong button all the time, and I'd be stopping when I mean to start, etc. Likewise, I've got the number 2 button pushed, set for a lock stitch. So one push will just take a stitch like this. So I'm using that when I'm stopping and starting to pull up my bobbin thread, and when I hold it down, it will do a lock stitch like this. 4 or 5 stitches, and I can tell it how many stitches I want it to take too. That's yet another setting. So those are just the 2 that I love to have there, but there are several things that I could program these buttons to do any of these choices. Press your foot up, down, needle only half a stitch, whatever the thing is that I want. And if I'm doing a different style of quilting, like custom quilting on that little guitar quilt, and I want it to be different just for this quilt, it's just that easy to change it. So that's a really handy feature. Oops, it ran right off the edge there. We'll just back up a little bit and catch that edge again. Good. And all of that funky stitching is going to fall right within the binding when it's put on the end, so no one will ever be any the wiser. Okay, did we have more questions you said online, Dave? And do I need to adjust the camera again? Not too badly. Okay, so a few more online questions. My machine is not quite level, it rolls away. In your home, by the way, you want to level your machine perfectly. It will work more smoothly if you do. Teresa, my husband knocked out a wall in the house for my Q20 10-foot Bernina, and I love it. Yay, Teresa! Remodel your house in order to fit your Bernina. I'm in 100% agreement. Okay, Noreen, when you do a freehand design, how do you start? Do you practice on paper first or wing it? I typically will practice either on paper or on that plexiglass sheet that I talked about with a dry erase marker, because I can do a bigger thing on that than I can on paper. So that's kind of my first choice. A couple things I do when I practice is I tend to practice with my whole arm and not with my fingers like this. So I like to have that big sheet because it forces me to move my arm, and that's more like my quilting. I am not really a doodler. Some quilters are, and they say if you want to be a free motion quilter, you've got to doodle and doodle and doodle and doodle. Maybe, if you're a doodler. I happen to not be. So I tend to just literally figure out a basic thread path that works, and then I start quilting it on something, and I work out the fine details there. That's just my medium. I'm happier working at the machine. Yes? I usually start right on the edge of the quilt. Again, that's just me. So the question was, do I start on the quilt when I begin one, or do I have a little practice bit on the side to start? I start on the quilt. This is not super fussy quilting, right? I will say if I'm doing custom quilting and I'm doing something really fine, really precision control, I will do something else first. It might still be on my quilt, but I'll be something that's kind of a warm-up, bigger swirls or something like that before I dive into the thing that needs precision. So in a sense, that's using my practice first. Yes? And the question is, what about thread breaks right in the middle? Were you here yesterday when my bobbin ran out? So essentially it's the same way. Whatever reason your thread breaks or your bobbin runs out, you've got a splice in the middle of the quilt. And I handle that largely the same way, which is I overlap a few stitches. First I undo back to where it was good. So if there was a yank on the tension and some of it is poor, or there might be gnarly thread underneath, then I back up however far I need to. And often I'll back up to where I'm stitching on a seam allowance, because that makes it yet more secure when I'm stitching through those layers. And then I just overlap a few stitches, do those lock stitches, and carry on. I'm sorry, I missed that? Well, you're not having to back up straight. By back up, I mean I undo a bit of the stitching back to where the stitching was good quality and carry on from there. Gotcha. Okay. Any more online? That was it?
No, say goodbye to online. I'll let them go.
Okay. All right. With that, we are going to wrap up our online portion, and I'll focus on my folks that are in-house. So thanks a ton for joining me again today. It's been really fun, and we will be back here at 1 p.m. today, Central Time, and working on some ruler work this afternoon and some fills within that, and hopefully some student interaction with some of that ruler play at the long arm. So I hope to see you then. Bye-bye for now.